Works in a district court for the county of Washington, state of Michigan, is now back in session. The honorable.
You may be seated. We're back on the record in the case of People versus Victor Bullard. Closing.
Assistant Public Defender Natalie Pickwick on behalf of Mr. Bullard, who is present.
I don't think I formally asked you, are there any witnesses for the defense?
No, Your Honor, I did discuss this again with my client, and he did, and I advised him of his absolute right to testify on his own behalf or to remain silent. And at this time, I will not be calling him or anyone else as a witness.
Very good. Closing arguments.
Your Honor, viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the people, the people do believe we've sustained our burden and ask to return a verdict on a single count of child abuse. Otherwise, I will rest on the proofs. Thank you, Your Honor.
Closing.
Thank you, Your Honor. So we're here today because of a father setting some ground rules for some of his teenage children and trying to enforce them. We've all here been teenagers before, myself not too long ago, if dare I say it, and we've all had arguments with our parents.
You're saying that's in the.
Pardon me, Your Honor?
You're saying that because why? You want to compare that to when I was last a teenager?
Probably.
Never mind, Miss Fake, go on.
And so, as Your Honor was also a teenager not too long ago as well, maybe even at the same time, but I do not know that. I've had arguments with my parents over rules they've set over the years. I believe many people, it's a common human experience. We've heard the testimony today that Miss Bullard wanted her TV back, and my client wasn't going to give it back for whatever reasons. I'm not going to comment on anyone's parenting, whether or not a teenager has a right to a TV, whether they do not, whether they have a right to go to their friends or not. My client was just setting some ground rules for his minor children that they happen to disagree with. They did have a verbal argument. And I will agree that they did have a verbal argument that day regarding the rules. However, my client never intentionally laid his hands on Ms. Bullard in any way. We did hear the testimony, and Ms. Bullard testified to the fact that Mr. Bullard grabbed her arms. I am not stating that that happened or did not. What I will say is that she did not at any point testify that Mr. Bullard touched her neck in any way. She did not testify that he grabbed her neck, that he tried to grab her neck, that he touched it even in passing. There was no testimony or evidence presented that he purposely or intentionally touched her neck or caused that scratch on her neck. Candidly, because we did see a photo of a scratch on Ms. Bullard's neck, I will acquiesce that she had one on that day, and that picture was taken by the police. We don't know how we got it, or how she got it. Candidly, I don't know how grabbing of the arms could lead to that scratch on the neck. My client is not guilty of this offense of child abuse in the 4th degree. He is the parent or guardian of Miss Asia Bullard. He did have care custody of her that day. He did not knowing intentionally harm her, injure her, or put her in a position where which she could be harmed. They did have a verbal argument. She was angry about that. When she talked to her older brother later that day, as Ms. Bullard testified, he encouraged her to call the police, which is what she did. When the police arrived, she declined medical attention, and Mr. Bullard was not there at that time. We don't know what investigation the police did to get his side of the story. That was not presented today. I am asking the court to return a verdict of not guilty, as people have failed to meet their burden that my client intentionally harmed Ms. Bullard in any way or caused that injury to her neck. Thank you, Your Honor.
And just briefly in your rebuttal, one thing, I do think that Miss Asia did state that the defendant scratched her as seen in Exhibit 3, and I do ask the court return a verdict of guilty. Thank you.
In Michigan's 14A District Court, Judge Simpson opened session, conflicts waived, lawyers spar, and the case of People versus Gary Chase collapses when a sick victim cannot appear, dismissed but not forgotten.
In this case, and we'll refer to her as Aisha because that's how she wanted me to be referred to. I listened very closely to her testimony in this case. Surprisingly, well, not, I won't say surprising. She was very candid in her answers. I'm not sure entirely, also, as I'm looking at her and listening to her testify. I feel bad for her. And I feel bad for her because, quite frankly, I think I haven't heard from Mr. Bullard or I haven't heard from Mom either. But I think both of them are failing her. And I say that because I think it's an interesting thing about kids, all they want to do is be loved. That's really all they want. And I think she's, frankly, as I understand this circumstance, being forced into a circumstance, regrettably, to choose sides, and she doesn't know why. Some of the unfairness that she talks about is that there's that unfairness of the some man who is just a friend, and I can only imagine what that's all about. Probably not necessarily the reality from either perspective, but dads sometimes react that way with their daughters. You know, young lady, one thing that you're going to have to kind of get used to regarding anyone that you bring into your life is, and I'm sure it's going to happen, same thing with Mom. You're going to see them. They're going to see them. They're going to make an immediate assessment. And then that's where it is. And they're going to have to either prove themselves worthy or not. It's just like. But on this day, and I asked some very specific questions of Asia, and I do appreciate her honest answers and appreciate at the end that she doesn't hate her father. There are probably things that are going on in that household, things in the world she doesn't quite understand. You know, she's only 16, so the only world she experiences is what's around her. Sometimes also the argument that parents and kids are having isn't really about what it is that sometimes happens with all human beings. It's probably about something much deeper. But as you listen to Asia, she was talking. Dad says X. She wants something else to happen. They begin yelling at each other. And as they begin yelling at each other, it begins to just sort of escalate. Asia said it best herself. When I asked, do you think your dad was trying to hurt you? And she said that he wasn't, that they were yelling at each other. But the one thing that she then pointed out was it got to where it got to. Don't think when you got to that doorway, it almost becomes this showdown at the door with both sides. not wanting the other to win or leave with the upper hand. Sometimes when you have a child that is trying to say something, whether screaming, yelling, doing whatever, because I guess the big people in the room, one has to sort of step back, kind of realize, or kind of try to figure out what it's all about. Dad said something that was interesting, but that wasn't satisfactory to Asia, especially about the boy and about everything else. That he was going to come back, he was going to see his mother, he was going to come back, and he was going to talk to her. On the surface, that seems kind of reasonable. And I guess if one were second guessing,
Asia describes pushing back on the door while her father forced it inward. The hollow wood split under pressure, both sides straining, locked in a standoff neither wanted to lose.
maybe there should have been a great pause and saying, maybe I need to talk with you now instead of going, because maybe that's what my child needs. I'm not going to sit there and second guess it. There. Sometimes that's what has to happen. I also don't think, well, Asia did what she did. I don't think really Asia relished the fact of having to sit here and try to testify against her dad. I don't think she liked it. I don't think she should, where one can help it, be there in that circumstance. Say this. Just gonna say it may be inappropriate. Mom and Dad, you got to do better. You just have to do better. You have a wonderful, beautiful daughter that was up here testifying, and the two of you have to do better. She should never think, either because it's true or either because it's something placed in her head, that the reason Dad is so hard on me is because I'm like Mom. First of all, I've never seen a child that is just one parent. Never seen it in my life, and doubt I ever will. They're part of both of you. And both of you need to acknowledge that she has those parts. Part of that yelling going back and forth between daughter and dad was because they probably are a lot more alike than they want to even acknowledge at times. She was going to try to give as good as she was trying to give, and that was just going to go. And then it was a point at which who's going to win or try to win. You guys have to do better. If it's true that Dad treats her a certain way because you're like Mom, well, that's something Dad has to get over and realize that's his little girl regardless. If that's not the case, but something being planted because of the dysfunctional dynamic that may be going on in that home, planted in her head by Mom, then Mom, you have to let that go. You two don't have to like each other, but you gotta love that little girl. Both of you.
Prosecutors introduce photos, scratches on her neck, dents in her bedroom door. The defense objects. Foundation challenged. Judge rules evidence admissible. The images tell a silent story words cannot hide.
Prove this charge of child abuse 4th degree, and I'll just skip to the elements. Clearly had custody or control. But the defendant knowingly or intentionally committed an act that under the circumstances posed an unreasonable risk of harm to the child, or did something in a reckless fashion that caused that to the child. I don't believe that people have sustained their burden of showing that by any stretch of the imagination. I don't believe that, based upon the testimony before me, that the defendant's conduct was by any means reckless. And by her own testimony, she admitted that the acts in and of themselves were intentional in terms of what was going on. Now, to the extent also that one might believe that they were intentional acts, the concept of parental discipline, that parents are certainly allowed to discipline their children within reasonable limits. Given the circumstances as described by Asia, the force on the door, I noticed that while there may have been a mark to the neck, I'm not thoroughly convinced that that came from the actions of dad, and certainly not any intentional act. The one thing that was missing, which would have seemed to have been there had he been in just this rage of anger, would have certainly been marks to her arms. I have no proof of that because she's very clear that he grabbed her arm. And if that was his first grab, there certainly would have been marks, bruises, something there when the police arrived. Given all of the circumstances and the totality of the circumstances, it's not up to the defendant to prove that his acts were reasonable, but more for the people to show that his acts were not reasonable. The people have not met their burden in that respect regarding the actions of the defendant on that day, ultimately ending up at the door. Asia's pushing on one side, dad's pushing on another side of the door. I think that there might be differences in that, but it certainly wasn't shown to the court that this was not an exercise in a certain respect of parental discipline with no intent by her own statement that this defendant was intending to harm. And so for those reasons, the court would find that the people have not sustained their burden, find the defendant not guilty of count 1 child abuse in 4th degree.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Asia, do me a favor. Take care of yourself, young lady. You've got a lot going for you. Okay? Take care. For a standing brief recess, we'll get set up for the PE.
All right. You see it.